interrupted or, however. Okay.
Students where these are high school. Anybody second?
Yeah, that's the top
Which,
one.
the top one?
Top one. It says
Okay.
CUNY.
Okay, got it. Got it, got it.
I'm sure.
Good morning, folks. We're going to start in about 2 minutes, so if there's anyone who wants to get coffee or fruit before we start. And if I can make a last-minute request to the people in the last 2 or 3 rows, on behalf of speakers, being able to look the people in the face and see your eyes is great. So if any of you in the back would be willing to move up, that would be great. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health here at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and I'm also the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And this is a session of our monthly forum, and we're pleased to go global today. Our focus a lot, as those of you who've been coming regularly know, is on food policy here in the New York City and New York State. But I think today's session illustrates some of the other influences on food, both here in New York City and the United States, but also around the world. And just to look first a little at the United States, 53% of the fruit consumed in the United States in 2016 came from other countries, and about 31% of the vegetables consumed in the United States. And these are more than doubling from 20 or 25 years ago. And as we'll hear in some of the presentations, that's what we get here from other countries, and what we send to them are the corn, soy, sugar products that are so associated with the global rise in non-communicable diseases and obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And so we want to look at that relationship. Doesn't seem like such a great deal from the point of view of global health. For those of you who looked at the newspaper or watched television this morning, you know trade is in the news, and President Trump announced yesterday that he wants to separate our negotiations with Canada and Mexico rather than to have a North American free trade agreement, to have separate ones. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to do is take a step back and to look a little more deeply at influence health and social conditions in both low and middle income countries, and also in high-income countries like the United States. And we have two very distinguished speakers, and our hope was that by focusing on two middle-income countries, Mexico and South Africa, we would be able to see some of the complexity of the current changes in food trade around the world. Our first speaker is Alicia Galvez, who's a medical and cultural anthropologist and a professor of Latin American and Latino studies at Lehman College at CUNY. And she's the author of a new book, Eating Nafta, Trade, Food Policies, and Destruction of Mexico, that will be out in the fall, is that right? And you'll get a preview of some of the issues that she talks about in her book. Our second speaker is David Sanders, who's emeritus professor and founding director of the School of Public Health at the University of Western Cape. And he's a pediatrician with training in public health and nutrition, and has been working for decades on both undernutrition and overnutrition as it plays out in South Africa and in other parts of the world. And he's also one of the founders of the People's Health Movement, a global NGO that has played an important role in looking at the connections between trade, health, and social justice. And our speakers will be looking at three questions, and we'll then have an opportunity to talk with them about those questions. The first is, how do global patterns of food trade and the trade treaties that govern that global trade shape diet and health at the local, national, and global levels? And we're especially interested, as I mentioned, in the impact on diet-related diseases. Many of you probably know the prediction that within the next several years, diet-related diseases will replace tobacco as the primary cause of premature death and preventable illnesses in the world. And we're seeing that transition here in New York City, but it's also taking place in the countries that we'll be hearing about today. The second question is,
how do trade agreements influence national public health practices? There is a concern in public health circles that the trade agreements that were negotiated in the last decade compromise the ability of national governments to protect public health. The language that scholars often use is they constrain policy space for things like taxation of unhealthy products, limits on advertising, especially to children, and intellectual property, both an issue in food, but particularly in pharmaceuticals. And then the third question that they'll be looking at is how do national and global food industries and systems interact in order to shape dietary choices in different parts of the world. And by focusing on South Africa and Mexico, places where those interactions between the global forces and the national forces play out differently, again, I'm hoping we'll get some insights into the complexity of these. So with that, I will turn it over. And I should mention both Alicia and David are colleagues and friends of mine, and I'm just very pleased to have them both here. And I think we're lucky to be able to share their many years of research and advocacy on these issues. Alicia.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Nick, for the invitation. It's really an honor to be on the same ticket with Nick and David Sanders. And today is a really great opportunity for me to get share with you some of my findings and get some feedback as the book is in its very final stages. And I've been hanging out here a lot. I wrote some of the last parts of the book here on the 6th floor, so it's nice to finally share the things that I've been hunched over my computer looking at for a while. This is an infographic that comes from Mexico that kind of illustrates what we see as sort of the current epidemic of diabetes and other non-communicable diseases in Mexico. 65 to 70,000 deaths a year, and 13 out of 100 deaths are caused by diabetes. And, you know, we have concentrations in some of the most populous states, and we have a lot of public costs, not only public health costs, but many related costs that are associated with what's been identified as a public health crisis and an epidemic on the part of the Mexican government and civil society. This is another infographic that comes from Mexico that shows the increase over time. 80% of diabetes is identified, according to Mexican health statistics, as being caused by overweight and obesity. And we can see the rise over time. When we look at the Nafta signatories, we can see the prevalence of diabetes is highest in Mexico, the gray bar, lowest in Canada. We can also see that it's more likely to be fatal in Mexico. People are more likely to be diagnosed later, to have more complications, and to have more extreme consequences, including death. One of the other things that is being focused on is not only the mortality rates, but the way that non-communicable diseases impact quality of life and productivity. In the neoliberal economy, of course, working is always important, and so it's not only mortality, but people's incapacitation as a result of disease. And so we see here the leading causes of disability-affected life years in 2013 and the percentage change from 1990 to 2013. So we can see diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and heart disease have risen quite a lot. Communicable diseases have decreased quite a lot. And we can see as well that diabetes is number one in terms of causes of death. We can also see between 2005 and 2015 that heart disease and diabetes have risen quite a lot. And we can also see that some of the other causes, such as road injuries and communicable diseases, have decreased. So this is sort of the sketch, the outline of what's been identified as the epidemic. And then we can ask ourselves, why is this happening so suddenly? Why this rapid increase? And we can see, just to give a little sketch, there's a lot more, and I know the size of the letters here is really awful, but we can see a disconnect between what was anticipated in terms of economic and social development with NAFTA and Mexico's shift towards global foreign investment and what the reality has been. And so on the top bar, we can sort of see what the idea was, and I'll walk you through it because I assume it's hard to see the letters. What the idea was in terms of Mexican development with NAFTA. So the idea was intentional to shift from small-scale agriculture with NAFTA to eventually have a expiration of corn tariffs and protections. Those were built in the initial stages, and they were intended to expire entirely within 15 years. There was a staged expiration because the idea was that there would be a fully integrated regional market, that the Mexican economy would be fully modernized and industrialized, and that Mexico would thus achieve prosperity, development, triumph against poverty, etc. The reality has been a lot more complicated. So we can see, we can see that there was, prior to NAFTA, a heavily small-scale agriculture-based economy. One of the things I analyze in the book that I won't go into now is that neither the more protectionist nor the more globalist presidencies in Mexico have really supported small-scale agriculture, but it's been a constant and sort of an important feature of the sustainability of Mexico's economy and the majority of the population's viability historically. But when we see the approach of NAFTA, we start to see a real strategy to the so-called de-peasantization of the countryside. The idea that the small-scale agricultural production was no longer seen as something that was suitable at all for the kind of economy that Mexico wanted. So when NAFTA goes into effect, we see an immediate sort of explosion of migration. We see there was an anticipated 500,000 people that would be displaced from the countryside as a result of NAFTA. What wasn't anticipated was that 500,000 people per year would be displaced to the United States, and many more within Mexico from the countryside to other parts of Mexico. Almost immediately also, the corn protections that were intended to protect the small-scale corn industry to prevent a flood of cheap U.S. corn were suspended because there was a so-called corn deficit. I get really wonky in the book about this. I will not bore you right now with that. But essentially, the tariffs that were intended to continue to protect the Mexican corn industry were almost immediately suspended after NAFTA. Also, we have to take into consideration corn and corn products. So there were never any barriers to corn products coming from the U.S. to Mexico. So even though there was an idea that Mexico's corn was culturally important to culturally and socially and economically important to protect, corn products flooded in immediately. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Corn prices fell 48%, and there was a deficit sort of diagnosed, and the deficit I put in quote marks because it's a little bit not convincing how it's defined, but 8 million tons per year. And so that's been basically the open door for U.S. corn to come into Mexico. And so we see a drastic rise in rates of non-communicable diseases. We see the price of tortillas rising 279% since NAFTA, a significant fall of consumption of tortillas. And even though in Latin America, in countries that did not sign trade agreements with the U.S., we've seen double-digit falls in rates of poverty since the late 80s, early 90s. In Mexico, which supposedly signed a trade agreement in order to defeat poverty, we have seen stagnant levels of poverty. The government's own statistics are about 50%. A lot of advocates think it's a lot higher, but 55% seems to be a pretty reliable number. Here we have Con Mexico is a Mexican agency that operates precisely to expand the reach of consumer products throughout the Mexican Republic, to lower barriers for trade and distribution, and to democratize consumption, even in the most rural and marginalized communities. I don't have time today to go into how the consumption model of economic development has really been made to dominate the national sphere. But for now, suffice it to say that the proliferation of industrialized goods, foods and beverages in particular, is complete. There's really nowhere you can go, even in the most rural, isolated community, where you won't find complete accessibility of industrialized food products. We also see, as Nick describes in his book, a multi-sectoral, multinational corporate collaboration between corporations through agencies like this one to oppose regulations, oppose taxes, and other limits on their ability, on corporate ability to do business in the global landscape. So this agency, really works to oppose things like the soda tax and to lower barriers for both Mexican and U.S. corporations. In some towns, we see, just to talk about the ubiquity, you can see a lot of towns that have recently had paved roads, and a lot of people will say the first thing that came down that road is the Coca-Cola truck. There's been a shift since NAFTA in terms of how and where people buy food. OXXO is a convenience store similar to 7-Eleven that's owned by the Mexican Coca-Cola Corporation, and it has 14,000 stores. One opens every day. It's second only to Walmart, and for every convenience store that opens, about 6 small-scale tiendas close. So tiendas are the small, privately owned, sometimes one room in the front of someone's house that sells products. The kind of products available in convenience stores and tiendas is not always completely different in terms of you can get soda and packaged snacks in both, but the OXXOs are really the only thing you'll see is beer, chips, soda, and ice, and coolers to carry it in. Whereas the tiendas sometimes would sell local food products, etc. So we can see, whereas in 2003 in rural communities, 90% of food sales in the cash economy, because a lot of people are getting food in other kinds of ways, was in tiendas, and now we see Walmart is the gray. We see other retail, smaller share of the market. Mexico has also seen a dramatic increase of sugar, syrup, and sweeteners from U.S. to Mexico since NAFTA. This is in spite of Mexico's quite aggressively protectionist sugar industry. So a lot of this is in the form of non-sugar sweeteners, so corn syrups and other kinds of sweeteners besides sugar. Sugary drinks consumed in Mexico per person. Just before the soda tax, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes, we see the peak of about 158 calories per day per person. Whereas before NAFTA, we see, a quarter of that, essentially. Another related factor, it's not just food and beverages that we see increasing. One of the big winners of NAFTA have been chemical companies, chemicals used in agriculture, chemicals used in livestock production, animal feed as well. So we see things like, I use Roundup as an example, but a 97% increase in chemicals from the U.S. to Mexico since NAFTA. We also see the chemical companies in 2015 alone, $55 million spent on lobbying for NAFTA-related trade deals, so trade policies. So they are very aggressive about making sure that they are allowed to operate. One of the examples of this is that Mexico had EU-like regulations on some chemicals before NAFTA. So BPA, for example, was banned. But according to the provisions in NAFTA, the U.S. requires its partners to adopt U.S. regulations. So we made Mexico get rid of its BPA ban. Mexico now imports 40% of its food supply, including a good portion of the corn consumed. So the corn that the U.S. exports, which I know many of you in this audience are certainly familiar with, is not corn that we can eat. So the little white segment is white corn, which is what would be typically used for tortillas and tamales. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, there's the purported corn deficit, which is what allows all of this corn to be exported from the U.S. to Mexico. But if there's a corn deficit, we imagine hunger. We imagine people need more corn for their tortillas. But the white corn is really an insignificant portion of what is going from the U.S. to Mexico. The vast majority is yellow and mixed corn, which is used largely for processed food and animal feed. And DDGS is the distiller's dried grains with solubles, so also used for processing and animal feed, and the cracked corn as well. So it's also important to note that the winners in this are not only U.S. corporations, but we can also see Mexican corporations benefiting. So Mexican processed food corporations have also been winning in this process. So Bimbo, for example, which bought Entenmann's, is the world's largest bakery goods corporation. And we see the rise of the sale of processed foods in Mexico. We see the significant portion of U.S. foreign direct investment in Mexican food industry is about a third. And we see the rise in investments, U.S. investments in the Mexican food industry just exploding from 1987, the blue bar, to 1999, the gray bar. Now, we can see the rise in diabetes. Since 2000, this is a pretty rapid increase. If we overlay this with the sales of processed foods, we can see an interesting correlation. Of course, correlation is not causation, but there's a pretty interesting similarity to the arc of increase in those two charts. And we can see it, as we walk around. This is Mexico City. We can see, as I mentioned, the proliferation, the ubiquity of processed foods, things like dorilocos. Sometimes we can see them alongside. So here we have tlayudas, which are a handmade corn, ground corn, handmade street food that's very popular. Aguas frescas, which might often be made of fruit, alongside things like Doritos. Here we have the national strategy against diabetes and obesity. I'm going to try to go fast, but and we could see, Marion Nestle in her book Soda Politics refers to Mexico as winning against the beverage companies because of its passage of a soda tax. It's a multi-sectoral campaign, and we can see, in fact, that there are pretty mixed results. The strategy asks individuals to take measures to better their health without recognizing or addressing the almost total transformation of the food system around them. This changed landscape makes it more possible for people to consume processed foods, irrespective of income level or even employment, and it makes it less possible to consume traditional foods. at the same time that lifestyles have become more precarious and people have longer commutes, migration and other things have disrupted traditional lifestyles. We can see in this image the main logo of the strategy. People, the main message is get your health checkups, eat in moderation, and get more exercise, which we can recognize as sort of the proliferation and the dominance globally of the energy balance theory of, it just being about calories in and calories out. The soda tax was, this is the results of the soda tax. According to the initial results, we can see a decline in the black line in sugar-sweetened beverages since the soda tax, slight decline. And when we look at the soda tax, we see that it was actually passed despite opposition from the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health herself was not in favor of the soda tax. She had come to the Ministry of Health from FunSalud, which is the Nestle Foundation for Health. And the negotiations for the tax largely excluded health and nutrition scholars and advocates, and it did include representatives from the industry. So in spite of industry opposition and industry involvement, the tax was passed, and I have my theories for why the president threw his weight behind it and why it passed in spite of industry opposition. But it was passed for 1 peso per liter, even though a lot of the statistical modeling said that it needed to be 2 pesos per liter in order to have the desired effect. After a year, there were campaigns to try to say that it had been ineffective and should be scrapped, or it should be split so that certain beverages would be taxed higher and other beverages taxed lower, in the minds of advocates trying to kind of shed confusion and make it more complicated so that people would kind of throw up their hands. Colleagues in Mexico yesterday told me that some of the data shows that some people are prioritizing soda in spite of the higher cost and doing things like changing shampoo brands in order to save money, in order to continue purchasing soda. And we can also see in ethnographic data from people like my colleague Liz Roberts at University of Michigan that a lot of people know full well what the health recommendations are and are quite interested in continuing to consume soda for other reasons, and a lot of those reasons are not really part of the public debate. I'm going to skip this, but if anybody has a particular interest in nutritional labeling, we can come back to it. And we can see, this is an example from civil society marketing. This is directed to children. It's distributed in the public schools. It's from Chespirito Foundation. If anyone watched Spanish language television as a child, you'll recognize these characters. It's marketing basically directed to children, as though children are making, the most important decisions about their health and nutrition, and encouraging, again, this idea of sort of the balanced plate, which we see everywhere, and drinking water, but really decontextualized from the larger context, as well as the way that families make decisions about eating. This is an example of a first grade classroom activity, also focusing on the good plate, the good, good eating. And then just to wrap up very quickly, I want to move through quickly. We do see an investment throughout the Republic in spite of disinvestments in some of the more basic aspects of health care and health coverage. We do see subsidized Zumba. We see subsidized yoga in public parks. I was told yesterday that in one community that someone was doing research, anyone who had out-of-control glucose was required to go to 3 classes of Zumba a week in the public park by the health promoters in the community. So we see overall a deliberate disinvestment in rural livelihoods, in the food system, and subsistence farming as part of Mexico's overall development strategy. And even though there are a lot of good feminist reasons why a lot of people don't want to grow and grind their own corn every day, we can also perhaps, it would be nice to see some acknowledgement by the state that the transformation of the economy has had public health consequences. And it would also be nice perhaps to see promotion of some ancestral ways of eating for their health benefits. The milpa-based diet of corn, chile, squash, and wild greens sustained, provided the fuel for great pre-Columbian civilizations, and really managed to persist throughout most of the modern era up until quite recently. And a lot of people still do eat that way. And this disinvestment is not so total that a lot of these things can't be reinforced. We do see the Mexican Tourism Agency promoting this way of eating, right? Gastronomic tourism, culinary tourism to Mexico to eat worms and crickets and hand-ground corn, but we don't see this sort of thing being promoted as a way to sustain health in a culturally specific way. And I'm wrapping up. I know I'm out of time. So, we could see more support of that. We could see support of the consumption of things like cactus, amaranth, chia, chaya, and so on, celebrating the transmission and sustainability of ways of eating that are culturally specific and relevant, and we could see that being sustained as a way to promote health. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everyone. Pleased to see so many people here, and that some were later than us. We got stuck on the subway, and a woman who is near me, I asked her if the number 3 was coming, and she said it's a crapshoot. Now, I don't know what that means, but it sounded pretty horrible. So thank you, Nick, for inviting me. I'm here with my colleague Rena Swart, who's a professor at University of Western Cape with me in South Africa, and she'll be able to answer the difficult questions. And Nick, I'm sorry, I didn't take note of the 3 questions you're asking us to answer, so I'm probably going to fail this test. So I've got something a bit different. I'm talking about some changes in health and nutrition and food security in South Africa, and I'm going to situate that within the global context, although I won't be talking very much about the global context. I'm going to cover the importance of nutrition in our health situation, and I'll focus first on the continuing problem of undernutrition and hunger, which remains a problem in South Africa. We have a double burden of malnutrition, and then I'll spend most of the time talking about overweight, obesity, and the impacts that has on health, and then look at dietary factors, the food environment, and how that's related to the global economic and political situation. And finally, a few interventions. So, I don't know if anyone before has seen Gapminder, but on the y-axis is life expectancy at birth, and on the x-axis is GDP per capita, which is a crude measure of wealth. So South Africa qualifies as an upper middle income country. It's not as rich as the US, which is in yellow there, but per capita, it's a middle income country. But you can see that our life expectancy is extremely low, discrepantly low. In fact, our life expectancy should be normal for a country that has a half or a third of the wealth of South Africa. So there has been improvement in life expectancy, indicated by this arrow, largely as a result of our very large antiretroviral treatment program, because as you know, we have a huge AIDS problem in our country with over 5 million people affected. However, this increase in life expectancy is now flattened off. So we remain well below the health levels you would expect for a country of our wealth. I won't comment that the US is well below Japan, which is slightly poorer. I think you know about that. So, what are the leading causes of premature mortality? So these are our latest leading causes in 2015. You can see that HIV/AIDS still tops the list, followed by TB, but we have persisting communicable diseases like lower respiratory infection, diarrheal disease, and I'll come to them later, a growing problem with non-communicable diseases and injuries. So quickly, to deal with the persisting problem, diseases which affect particularly young children and women in the childbearing age, you can see that HIV remains a problem. However, pneumonia has caught up proportionately. So as HIV occupies less of this pie, so pneumonia has become a bigger problem, as has diarrhea and, of course, newborn deaths. So all of these four causes of young child death are intimately related to nutritional status, undernutrition. So what's the prevalence? So unfortunately in South Africa we have a very high prevalence of chronic undernutrition manifesting as stunting, being too short for your age. And these aren't the same samples, but the dark bar from a big survey in 2005 and the lighter bar 2012. And you can see that over that period, and indeed since the 90s, our stunting rate has remained at over 25%. That means 1 in 4 children are chronically undernourished. You'll notice the underweight rate has dropped. So this is telling us that these short children are becoming a bit plumper. This presages the obesity problem which is facing us. We have a persisting problem of vitamin A malnutrition, 3 different surveys at different times, split by almost 20 years. And we have a persisting problem of iron deficiency and anemia amongst women. This despite the fact that we fortify our basic foodstuffs. We can talk about that later, and Rena has some insights there. So, just to apply a very simple model to analyze some of the causes, the downstream biological moving upstream to the structural. You may not be able to see this, but breastfeeding rates in South Africa are very, very low. In fact, until a few years ago, we had the lowest exclusive breastfeeding rates in the world. They've gone up a bit, and approximately 24% of children under the age of 6 months are exclusively breastfed. So it's gone up from an 8% that it was, which is one of the unfortunate side effects of our HIV epidemic, where formula milk was promoted wrongly in the view of some of us, and of course the formula companies made hay during that time. So children get a very poor start in life, and we have widespread food insecurity. So this is a hunger index. I'll show some data later. About a quarter of South Africans report frequent hunger, and in some provinces like the Eastern Cape on your extreme left, you can see 36%. And at the root of all of this is extreme poverty. So 6 out of every 10 children live in a household where income is by now about 650 Rand per person per month. If you divide that by 12.5, you get about $50 per person per month. And inequality, unfortunately, has increased. The richest 10% have over 50% of income share in South Africa, and you can see the lower quintiles, the lower deciles have very small shares. So, undernutrition and hunger in South Africa is a political problem. Many of our colleagues project it as a technical problem, often having a very productionist viewpoint. That's not the problem. South Africa usually produces a surplus of agricultural products. The problem is access to sufficient and good food. So, what about the NCD problem? So these are all, as you know, diet-related, and they're increasing in prevalence. This comes from the Western Cape, where Rena and I live. It's not a cohort study, but it's a study done in the same areas, separated by 18 years. So the light bars are 1990, and the dark bars are 2008-9. And you can see that in that 18-year period, particularly in the older age groups, there's been a doubling or tripling of the prevalence of diabetes, such that more than a third of people suffer from diabetes, older people suffer from diabetes. Our overweight and obesity rates have gone up. These are data from 1998 through to 2016. I've only circled women here because they are the ones who have the bigger problem, but it affects all groups in the population. So the lighter bar, the lighter pink bar, is overweight, and the red bar is obesity. So obesity rates in women are over 40%. So using this framework again, what are the causes and the causes of the causes? So first of all, dietary behavior. So Rena and I are involved in a research project called ROFE, Researching the Obesogenic Food Environment. And we're collecting data in poor communities in an urban and a rural setting. Now, sample sizes aren't huge, but you will see later that these reflect what we're seeing going on generally. So we're trying to better understand the food environment in South Africa, and we're working with partners in Ghana who are doing same research. And we're trying to look at what's driving these changes and what are the potential policy levers. So we're only at the end of the first phase, which deals with the first few objectives: the range, quality, and costs of food purchased. How do poor and vulnerable consumers make decisions about where, when, and why to obtain food, and who are the key suppliers? So first of all, in our sample, which is reflective of our population, you can see that the vast majority of people in Khayelitsha, which is the urban setting, in blue, and the rural setting, Mount Freer, in red, the vast majority have a household income of less than 3,000 Rand. So divided by 12.5, and you will see what that is. Average household size, 5 to 6 people. Very few people who are well off. We have estimated lived poverty index, and you can see that top line, not enough food. Some people report that once or twice, and the orange, several times they've experienced hunger. And then we go down to clean water, without medicines, not enough fuel to cook. Quite a significant minority have that problem, and no cash income, and even bigger group report that. This is for the urban setting and a bit worse for the rural setting, particularly with regard to water and access to medicines. The household hunger scores are very similar in both Mount Freer and Khayelitsha, and they fit in with the national data, which I showed a bit earlier. 16 or 17% experience moderate hunger frequently. So, in the Sanhain study, which was a big sample across South Africa, they found that 18% of the population had a high fat intake and almost 20% a high sugar intake. Sugary beverages, we don't have such detailed data as Mexico, but we know that South Africans consume very large quantities of Coca-Cola and other sugary beverages, about 3 times the global average, and it has increased dramatically since the early 90s. We've got some idea about the factors that influence shopping, price being the commonest, the red are females who do most of the shopping, and then other factors like taste, health considerations, but importantly, in our setting, also how long the food item keeps, because most poor people do not have refrigerators. So this is a factor in the kinds of food choices that people make, and also fuel for cooking. And then there are social factors. So, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, people did not want to be seen to be underweight because this carried some stigma. And also there are cultural perceptions of body image, which a colleague of ours does work on. And amongst middle-aged and older women, it's actually desirable to be overweight. It's a reflection of prosperity. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are ill. And then there's this issue of modernization. So, moving upstream to some of the structural factors. So what's happening in the retail sector? So these are data from our ROAF study. I don't expect you to be able to decipher all of these. I've put red rings there. So this is for Khayelitsha, the urban setting. And you see that formal retailers supply, or people get food from them mostly on a monthly basis. That's what they do, their bulk shopping at supermarkets. But informal, the bar next to them, they use informal outlets, small shops, which sell the same kind of food weekly or even more often than that. And very similar in the rural area. Penetration, as you said, Alicia, penetration of supermarkets well into the rural hinterland. So we've got some sales data. You may not be able to read this from the back, but it shows the rate of change of sales between 2005 and 2010 of various processed and packaged foods. So ready meals have gone up by 43%, snack bars 43%, and noodles 45%. In just a 5-year period, people's dietary patterns, well, at least the sales of these foods, have changed very rapidly. And we have significant concentration of the packaged food market. And the companies that are most dominant, there are 10 of them, 5 South African, the biggest being Tiger Brands. And then we have some of the usual suspects, Unilever, Parmalat, Nestle, and Cadbury, and so on. and you won't be able to read the product types, but most of these are processed or ultra-processed products. And the big transnationals have certainly got countries like South Africa, and I would suggest Mexico, middle-income countries with growing urban populations or populations that purchase a lot of their food. They have us in their sights. That's where their market expansion is likely to occur. As you can see, their estimates of the Swiss franc value of the markets. And indeed, the market size of South African packaged foods has doubled from 2005 on your left to 2015, a doubling of the size in value of the packaged food market size. And there's been a very rapid growth in supermarket sales. Here's the rate of growth, the percentage increase between 1999 and 2005 in South Africa versus the US and Japan. And a colleague, Jane Battersby, has mapped in the Cape Metro, where we live, the growth of supermarkets between 2003 and 2013, each dot being a supermarket, and the poorer parts of the metro are this area here. So consumers in the rural areas pay more than consumers in the urban area, and healthier foods are more expensive than processed and ultra-processed foods. So finally, this is what Nick wanted me to talk about. Trade. So these are trade data from 1992 to 2016 of the category called bread, pastry, cakes, etc. And you can see there's been an exponential rise in trade of these products, of pasta as well, and sugar confectionery imports leveled out a bit lately, but a massive growth in the 1990s, and sugary beverage imports, even though we have our own manufacturing capacity in South Africa. And of course, we are a staging post for entry into the region. So these are carbonated beverage exports to SADC, the Southern African Development Community, which comprises countries in our region all the way up to Tanzania, which is quite a long way north of South Africa. So I tell my friend, or should I say my erstwhile friend, the Minister of Trade, that we're exporting obesity. Doesn't like that. So these are our sugary beverage exports, our cereal-based product exports, and our processed meat exports into the region. There's an article we published a few years ago showing on the extreme left, 1995 to 1998, on the right, 2007 to 2010. The black is imports into South Africa, and the lighter colored part of the bar are imports into SADC countries other than South Africa. So some of those imports are coming from South Africa, but they're also coming from, in particular, Europe. And all of this is facilitated by our equivalent, I suppose, of Nafta. These are regional trade and investment policies which essentially have liberalized trade and investment very significantly. These are the policies and agreements that have been signed since the early 1990s, allowing for much easier flow of products and financial investment across borders. So finally, something we published. I should have brought a copy with me today, but I coordinated a small project which looked at it's called small operators versus multinational corporations in the food systems of Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. And there are really striking similarities, that every single node of the food value chain, from inputs to agriculture, pesticides, chemicals, seeds, and so on, all the way through to retail and marketing, are controlled by fewer and fewer large corporations and similar ones in the three countries. This is just McDonald's, just as an example, and McDonald's is starting to become big in South Africa, although our biggest example of foreign direct investment in the fast food areas is KFC by far. And by the way, I'm not related to Colonel Sanders. People have asked me that before. So, big food is becoming more widespread and more implicated in unhealthy eating in South Africa. It involves South African companies and foreign companies, and they've developed strategies to increase the availability, affordability, acceptability of their foods. They're extremely aggressive in price fixing. There have been some competition commission cases brought against food companies for collusion in price fixing. And Rena and I actually wrote a deposition because of a bread fixing case, disgraced really, 4 big bread companies, fixed prices, and bread is a staple for most people in South Africa. And so we're saying the South African government should act urgently to address this. So I'm going to end with just a little bit of hope. So some colleagues, and we're here for this really, some colleagues at Wits University working in a group called Priceless have focused on sugary beverages. So sugary beverage sales have risen very dramatically since the early 2000s, especially of carbonated sugary beverages. And there's been a process of research, advocacy, and lobbying to push for a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in South Africa, and we've succeeded in that. This tax was imposed on the 1st of April, and we are here, and Rena will be doing a lot of that work, to evaluate the impact of this tax on consumption of sugary beverages, but also on other foods that people consume. And so the tax was originally proposed as a 20% tax, but with industry lobbying, influencing of some of the parliamentarians, it's been dropped to 10% tax. There's still fight back from the industry. If you read the popular media, there are many people who are front people for the industry who write about the fact that this had no impact in Mexico, which is not true. Impact may not be as big as had been expected, but there's an impact. And we are also starting to work on front of pack labeling. Rena's heading that work. So the beverage industry has fought back in these ways. And so this is my last slide. So this is just very impressionistic, but when I teach, I try to impress on students that unfortunately we can no longer resolve the problem of food security enough and good quality food at just the local level. It is clear. We have to operate at a national and, unfortunately, at a supranational level. So I won't read through all of these, but I think you know. So, for example, this fiscal measure, tax on sugary beverages, we've started, but we have not yet got policy congruence between our ministries. So our Ministry of Trade welcomes in Burger King, who thankfully is not doing so well in South Africa, and we sigh in the health sector, looking at the downstream adverse effects of that. So there is kind of policy conflict within government. The Ministry of Trade does not take health impacts into consideration. So we need to do work, which has been done on sugary beverages, but we need to do more work on costing the negative impact of this increasingly processed and ultra-processed food environment on health. What does that do to health costs and, of course, to human costs? We haven't done that work yet. We need to do that work because I'm afraid that in some of the more powerful sectors of government, they will listen to figures, but they're not so interested in our arguments. So I will stop there. I'm sure I've failed because I think I've only answered one of Nick's questions, but I'd be happy to try and entertain some in discussion. Thank you.
And if I can ask the three of you to put the microphone close, and that's for the live stream, if the audience can hear you. Yeah. And I might turn this on. So thank you very much, and you elucidated the topic of interest, David, whether or not you answered all three questions. And I think what I took from the two talks is really the challenge of finding at least two different kinds of balance. The first is the balance in our finding the right balance in our interventions between what we can address at the local or municipal level, a big topic of interest to us here in New York City, and what needs to be addressed at the national and global levels. And it's complicated, right? I think we've heard in both understanding the similarities and the differences between the food environments in Mexico and South Africa. And then the other challenge that I think David highlighted is finding the right balance between downstream, and certainly for a long time the conventional wisdom in nutrition is all we needed to do was to educate people to make healthier food choices, and that would address the food problems we were facing, and upstream, where, as we can see, as Alicia explained in Mexico, there was really a transformation of the environment in which individuals made food choices, and to expect to see changes in outcomes without understanding those changes in the environment would leave us short of achieving our health goals. And so with that, I wanted to open it up for your questions, comments, and reactions to the two speakers. And our usual practice here is to hear 2, 3, 4 questions, and then I turn it over to the speakers to respond. You don't both need to respond to all the questions if you choose not to, and then we'll take another round. So, is there someone who would like to get the discussion started? So why don't we take one on that side and one on that
side. Hi, my name is Ramon Alvarez. This is more of a question.
Close to your mouth, please.
Oh, yeah. My name is Ramon Alvarez. I'm an MPH candidate at NYU with some of my colleagues here. My question is more directed to Ms. Galvez. Where do you see the largest rise in these obesity rates? Like, are they in northern Mexico, close to the border, or in the rural, like Oaxaca in Chiapas. Where do you really see that?
Let's hear another question.
For the professor from South Africa. Thank you. So interesting. I'm stuck on one of your early statistics, which is the persistence of stunting, but obesity among the stunting population. Did I hear that correctly? That suggests to me that stunting is genetic. Is that the case? I mean, I'm kind of stuck on how you can have obesity but also stunting at the same time. Thank you.
And one more question. Someone else wanted to ask something? Oh, well, work on your questions, and Alicia can start.
Thank you for the question. I don't know if this is on.
Close to your mouth.
Okay. In Mexico, it's similar to the United States. We see it associated with income more than region. Obesity, the rise in obesity is associated with higher levels of poverty and marginalization. So the states with larger income inequality are the states that have higher rates of obesity. And it's in rural areas as well as urban areas, but it corresponds quite closely to income. And like South Africa, there is some co-occurrence of stunting and malnutrition in terms of insufficiency of food, along with diet-related illness, which is still unfortunately being understood by the strategy against obesity and diabetes as a problem of excessive calories as opposed to other factors.
Yeah, thanks for the difficult question. So stunting, being too short for your age, it's very complicated. I don't think we understand fully the etiology, but certainly we know it happens with dietary inadequacy, mostly in qualitative terms, quality of the diet, and repeated infection. So I had a slide which I eliminated because I had too many, which shows that actually stunting starts very early in South Africa. Actually, there are more than 30% of babies born are stunted. So this reflects the intrauterine nutritional environment. So their mothers are also undernourished. They may be obese, but they have micronutrient deficiencies, and some of them have protein deficiencies. So we do see in the same households obese mothers and stunted children. And it's not because the mothers are stealing their children's food. It's because they're both living on a diet that is qualitatively inferior. So the deficit in calories, which may exist, is much less than the deficit in micronutrients and probably protein. So this problem of the double burden of malnutrition is quite common in a large number of countries that are of low or low middle income. So in South Africa, it's very depressing for us to note that this problem of undernutrition manifesting as stunting is just continuing. And the stunted children aren't as underweight as you'd expect for their height. So this suggests that these stunted children have a greater likelihood of becoming obese adults. And indeed, there's a hypothesis called the Barker hypothesis, which proposes that when children or when fetuses are exposed to a low nutrient environment in utero, after birth, if exposed to a high calorie environment, they are very effective and efficient in using all of those calories. So there's a kind of a biological explanation that these organisms are programmed to make the best use of what's delivered to them after they've experienced hunger in utero.
Can I ask two clarifying questions? The first, picking up on the speaker's questions. So, for the most part, there's not a genetic component to these problems. It's more environmental. And the second question is, if I understood your presentation correctly, the historic, the changes in the food environment in South Africa over the last 20 years have made both these problems of undernutrition and overnutrition, and in the same populations, worse. So the changing food environment is exacerbating these problems?
I don't think we can say that the undernutrition problem has become worse. It hasn't improved much. It's improved very little. But we have had an undernutrition problem for a long time. In fact, when Rena and I first started working together, that was our sole focus, on underweight, micronutrient deficiencies. Those have persisted. On the issue of genetics, you're right, except that some people now are supporting this Barker hypothesis by showing some epigenetic changes. Okay. So it is largely an environmental problem. And of course, we've seen in countries like Brazil, which 25 years ago had high levels of stunting. They've actually reduced stunting in Brazil, even in the poor Northeast, to almost zero through social policies. However, they have a very big obesity problem.
Good, thank you. Other questions, comments?
Yes, I'm interested that both countries have passed soda taxes. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the way that was done politically, especially when governments have competing interests, such as the trade and health policies. So it would be very interesting to hear a little bit more about that from both countries.
So let's hear one more on this side, and then two on this side, and then we'll have answers again.
My question is for Alicia. Given the possibility that Nafta might be renegotiated shortly, what type of changes would you like to see that might help the issues that you spoke about?
And a couple from this side.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. Thank you both for speaking today. Your insights are very valuable. I was wondering, we've seen recently in countries such as Chile that there's been a move towards warning packaging or warning labels on packaging and removing characters that appeal to children. And Dr. Sanders or Professor Sanders mentioned that South Africa is also moving in that direction. Is Mexico coming around to some of those types of practices? And if so, what do you see happening there in the future?
Let's have one more on.
My question is for Dr. Galvez as well, specifically about, I know that under the Trump administration, as NAFTA comes up for renegotiation, this is an administration that's a lot more industry friendly, and I'm wondering if you see the soda tax being threatened by that.
Where to begin? So the politics and the labeling question, I think, can go together. My analysis, and I'm not sure I'm correct in this, but no one has yet proven me wrong or told me I'm wrong, so I'll keep spreading it around. My analysis is that the president, the current president of Mexico, who there will be a new one in a few months, wanted to do something really radical in the energy sector and in education. He wanted to do reforms that were going to be very unpopular. And so my analysis is that he saw the strategy against obesity and diabetes as something progressive, populist, that would buy him a little bit of social capital with different opposition groups doing something sort of Bloombergy to kind of, do something for the public health sector that would buy him a little social capital just before he was planning to do these really drastic, unpopular reforms in the energy and education sectors. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. The administration has been very pro-foreign direct investment, very pro-globalization. So there's no reason they would suddenly not be doing everything that the industry wants the way they usually do. So that's my sense of some of the politics of it. And the way that it was done has been quite interesting because it has gotten so much good press globally as being extremely progressive and forward-thinking. At the same time that people working on these issues in Mexico are sort of appalled at how much it was weakened and diluted, and how much industry and how many conflicts of interests were involved in the negotiation. So it's somehow there are a lot of aspects to it. So in addition to the soda tax, there was a ban on marketing during certain hours of the day on television of processed foods. There was a ban on junk food, broadly defined within a certain perimeter of schools. There were kiosks that would be like right outside the door of the school that are no longer allowed. And labeling things that all have been part of this. And so it's a pretty multifaceted program. The soda tax has gotten the most attention. Each of these, has its caveats, and as soon as you dive in, you can kind of see there's a lot of details where a lot of the advocates feel like things were not done properly. The slide that I didn't show you, that I skipped past, in terms of the labeling, you need a magnifying glass and a PhD in nutrition to, understand even the front of package labeling. So it's a little bit tricky and difficult. Let's see, there was a renegotiation of NAFTA. I'm not really hopeful that health is even on the radar, or can be or will be. And even in Mexico, the soda tax and the strategy have really happened outside of the health sphere. It's really been the economic ministry, the Ministro de Hacienda, which promoted the soda tax, really trying to get a handle on the economic consequences of chronic disease more than, kind of from a public health perspective. So there's a possibility that that's an angle that can emerge. And I think that there's a certain amount of nationalism in terms of what's happening right now. Today, I think Mexico said that they would be issuing tariffs on U.S. cheese and whiskey and things like that in response to Trump. So, I hope that the pride and cultural chauvinism of Mexico, I think rightfully so, about its food, its cuisine, its culture, can maybe be an angle in which there's more attention to kind of protecting corn and protecting some of these ancestral ways of eating that would benefit health, that may not be in a traditional kind of health frame. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah, I think did I answer the soda tax question in terms of the politics? Yeah, except it's as with everything, it's complicated because the soda tax was supposed to go to installing potable water fountains in public schools, which the vast majority of schools don't have, which is, when I first heard that, I thought, how is that possible and how is that so hard? And it's mind-bogglingly difficult, and almost no schools have had it. They actually did a photo op where the health minister was going to go and drink from the first water fountain, and they had to jerry-rig a fake, pump on the back of it because it wasn't working on the day. Of what the soda tax has actually produced in terms of the revenue. So there is money being collected. Whether it's being used on what it was supposed to be used for is another story.
So on soda tax in South Africa, I don't have a lot more to say except that, the process which was followed really, I think, was based on the Mexican experience, where first of all there was research done, and I showed a couple of slides about the change in consumption of sugary beverages, and of course associated changes in obesity and diabetes and so on. And then some economic calculations looking at both the costs and the benefits of imposing a soda tax. And the benefits, although delayed, vastly outweigh the costs. Although industry has been I suppose, exaggerating the number of jobs that will be lost as a result of this sugary beverage tax, and unfortunately for a period had the largest trade union confederation on their side opposing the sugar tax. Nonetheless, government did bite the bullet, although only half the bullet, because it was only a 10% as opposed to a 20% tax. And now we are starting to evaluate what, if any, impact this has. As Nick knows, I'm a glass half empty person, so I'm not very confident this is going to have a big impact in South Africa, because we haven't had nearly as extensive a campaign as Mexico had before introduction of the tax. We have had a campaign, quite good, but really didn't reach out very far. We're finding in some of our field work that actually a lot of people don't even know that there's a soda tax, tax on sugary beverages. And also because of the poverty situation, people don't have a lot of choices about what they're going to drink and eat. So we'll see. On the question of front of pack labeling, so we are now just started on research about what would be an appropriate front of pack label for South Africa. We too have these completely incomprehensible front of pack list of ingredients. You not only have to have a magnifying glass, you really have to know what all of these things are. It's clearly inappropriate. So we're looking to a simpler front of pack label, whether it's going to be a positive or negative thrust. You know, positive is like green and red traffic lights and so on. Negative is like the very stark Chilean example where there's a warning label, basically. Some of us are leaning towards that. So I just wanted to mention one other thing, because we've talked, of course, about trade and liberalization of trade and how that is impacting the food environment. What we haven't talked about, which is a really big phenomenon in countries in Africa, not so much South Africa, but in other countries to the north of us, is the issue of land grabs. So land grabs are becoming a very big thing now, where surplus capital, finance capital, and we're in the age of finance capital, needs to be invested somewhere. And investors are buying up very large tracts of land in the global south, Africa in particular, but also in Latin America. And often that land is not being used, it's just appreciating in value, but it is being used often to produce the basic substrates like corn for processed products. So the grains are grown in the global south, and then of course they are processed and converted into manufactured ultra-processed products which then get exported to us. So this is a very big phenomenon. It's growing. And lastly, as you possibly know, food prices since about 2006 have just gone up massively. And that is due in particular to speculation on food futures, which I think is happening mainly in this city, but in other places, where traders are speculating on the value, the future value of basic agricultural commodities like corn, like wheat, and so on, and buying up in advance of the harvest big proportions of that harvest, creating an artificial shortage, then releasing it onto the world market and making a big buck, but causing food prices to rise. So it's another dimension. We're not talking about it today, but it's definitely impacting on people's ability to be food secure.
And one more reflection of really the commoditization, the financialization of food being a product and a commodity on the market rather than a public good. We have time for one more question, but my hope is that Alicia and David and perhaps Rena can be around for a little bit more to answer any questions that don't get asked publicly.
Hello everyone, my name is Marlene. My question is for Anders. I want to know, I'm curious, like, why country like Cuba don't have like almost the same diabetes and obesity problem like South Africa and Mexico?
And I wanted to add a question for your closing comments. There is a lot of attention to trade these days and to trade pacts, and it's both at the political level, but it's also at the public health level where there's been a re-examination. And I wonder if each of you could comment just briefly about what do you think are the opportunities for public health researchers, for public health professionals to participate in that dialogue on trade and to encourage looking a little deeper.
Good question. I would actually, other studies that aren't my study that I think would be interesting to do, I think it would be interesting in the Americas to do a comparative study cross-nationally too, and then Melissa Fuster is here who does cross-national work, but to look at the correlation between proximity of ties and influence of the U.S. and diet-related illness, because Chile, the very long history of intervention and meddling in the Chilean economy, and Mexico are two very strong examples of the highest rates of diet-related disease and consumption of highly industrialized food products, and the political interventions correlate. So Cuba has gone its own way for a very long time, and so I think that obviously there's a lot of problems that the embargo has produced in terms of people not being able to get things, but one of the things that they haven't gotten has been showered with as many industrialized food products. So it would be interesting to do a comparative study looking at both ends of that spectrum. Trade and health and what possibilities there are for better policy, is that the question? I think that for researchers, for students, for the public discussion, it's something that I've struggled with because I didn't come to this as someone interested in trade. I came to this as an anthropologist who's worked on Mexican migration for 2 decades, and I was really curious. When I started this project, it was because I just finished a project looking at birth outcomes, and I was seeing that people were bringing with them from rural parts of Mexico ideas and practices that were very protective and beneficial, and then the U.S. was stripping them away in our public health care system, often inadvertently, without that loss being noted or mourned. But then I began to see that a lot of the communities, the families that I knew from 20 years ago were telling me, my sister has diabetes, my mother had an amputation, kidney disease. And so I was curious about what was happening in these rural communities that I had been associating with healthful lifestyles. And so that was sort of my entree. And I think that we need to, really bring interdisciplinary frameworks, because there's something about trade, and this was true of me for before this project, that causes our eyes to glaze over. Part of the reason that these things get passed the way that they do is the behind closed doors nature of the negotiations, but also because most of us don't care. We really don't think it affects us. And so whatever we can do, I think, conceptually within different disciplinary formats, and one of the tricks that I use in my book is to talk a lot about the taco boom and how popular tacos are and how ubiquitous they are and how much I love eating them and other people seem to love eating them. And why is it that we can get hand-ground corn tortillas in New York City now, but people are eating less of that corn in Mexico now? So that was sort of one of my entry points. And so I think whatever we're doing, if we can try to unpack these issues so that it's not just policy wonks that, God bless the policy wonks, but so that everybody that realizes that we're all implicated, for better or for worse. Our own health and the health of our neighbors is implicated in these issues. I think if we can use, all the tricks in our toolkit to try to unpack these issues and make them interesting and relevant to everyone.
So I won't add to the answer on Cuba, except to note that they do have quite a high prevalence of NCDs. Not such a high prevalence of obesity, but a lot of smoking-related disease and so on. And, of course, if the embargo is lifted, I expect that they will have bigger diet-related problems. So, on the issue of trade is very complicated. And we had a great talk yesterday at this meeting we were at, sponsored by Bloomberg, on trade. And countries don't have a lot of room to maneuver because of agreements that they've signed up to under the World Trade Organization. So South Africa's got a famous case where an agreement, TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, under the WTO was challenged in our constitutional court around drugs to treat AIDS. I think you may know about that famous case that our Treatment Action Campaign in partnership with others won, and that had an impact in other countries as well. That South Africa was then allowed, despite US opposition, partnered with Big Pharma, pharmaceutical companies, not farmers, opposed this, and they were defeated. But the main reason was because the proponents of the change could show that a public health emergency trumped, sorry to use that word, the trade considerations. So, according to our Minister of Trade, the only way he would be able to prevent the influx of unhealthy foods was if we could show that public health considerations mean that these are dangerous, but we would have to show that those products are more dangerous than South African equivalents. And unfortunately, we can't show that. because we have such a unregulated environment that some of our South African products are worse. So one of the successes South Africa has had in the last few years is imposition of regulations to control sodium content foods. So we can, I don't know if we're doing it, Rena, but we can prevent the influx of more salty foods than our own local products, for example. But I think finally, just on this, the things we have to do as a public health community are, first of all, to do some of the difficult work, which we can't do by ourselves. We'd have to work with economists, friendly ones, and trade specialists to be able to show the disbenefits in monetary terms of allowing such unregulated trade to continue. And we would have to show that these exceed the purported benefits, like jobs and so on. And that's big work, and I think we need to do it. But actually, most importantly, what we have to do, and I'm putting my People's Health Movement hat on now, is we need to essentially create a mass movement, as was done in treatment action, for access to affordable treatment for HIV/AIDS. We have to create a mass movement around this issue, and actually around the negative impacts of neoliberal globalization. I mean, that's what's been demonstrated. So there is no middle road here. You either have to be a supporter of globalization and be able to demonstrate that for public health and for well-being, its benefits exceed its harms, or on our side, my side, showing that actually inequalities are increasing. In some countries, like your own, life expectancy is reversing. We've got a massive epidemic of NCDs, which are going to cost us a lot into the future, let alone the human suffering. And we have to be able to communicate this outside of these arcane environments. That's the first step. And we have to create social movements around this. Because if we don't, we're lost.
If I can just amplify your last story and maybe frame it a little differently, and that's the story of lowering the prices of antiretrovirals, first in South Africa, but then also in Brazil and other countries around the world, that saved tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. The particular alliance that led to the reduction of the U.S. opposition was an alliance between the Treatment Action Coalition, a group, a civil society group in South Africa, that asked for help from ACT UP, a civil society group here in the United States. This was during the 2000 presidential election, and they convinced ACT UP to attend Al Gore's campaign rallies. Al Gore was the chair of the U.S.-South Africa Trade Commission, and that Trade Commission had opposed allowing South Africa to produce a generic, low-cost antiretroviral. And because ACT UP embarrassed Al Gore, who wanted to be seen as promoting health and supporting action against AIDS, the U.S. government reduced its opposition. The government itself, even though Big Pharma didn't change its point of view, said that they would not oppose South Africa's producing of this. And I think what that illustrates is the question isn't yes, globalization or no globalization. In my view, globalization is here to stay, but it's who's going to manage that globalization. And I think what the Treatment Action Coalition and the ACT UP Alliance shows is that there can be a globalization from the bottom up, and that when social movements in different countries can find common ground, we have a power, even though it's a different power than the power of multinational corporations, to actually bring about policy change. And we, in public health, can be important contributors to that. I know some of you have questions that haven't been answered yet. I hope you'll come up and ask them. And thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to our two panelists for their wonderful talks. And also there are some resources for those who want to read more on the back of this. And this presentation will be live streamed on our website, and if you want friends to see it, they'll be able to.